Hello everybody and welcome back to the channel, or welcome for the first time if you're new around here. I'm Vivian Asimos and I'm writing a book all about the anthropology of cosplay. And in this series for the next couple of months, I'm going to be going through once a month and talking about a particular theme that's come up in the book through the research. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what people have said in the field work and then a little bit about what I think about it, just to give you a little hint as to what's to come, as well as to help me kind of think through all of the different things that are going on that I then have to write about. So it's a win-win. So today we're talking all about community. And the thing about community with cosplay is that obviously it was going to be a huge part of what I'm doing. When you're an anthropologist and you go into a place to do research, typically what it is that you are looking for a particular kind of boundary of people to study, a community. In more historic approaches to anthropology, this was a lot easier because a lot of the times they were going out to the jungle to talk to a tribe that was kind of preset over there. When you're doing a lot of pop culture stuff, it can be a lot more difficult because a lot of the community groups are more amalgamous, they change frequently, and they kind of flow into each other. So it's very difficult to kind of create boundary lines. So obviously the conversation about community was really important. However, that all being said, this particular conversation is not going to be about what I mean by community or what those boundary lines are or why I use the word community instead of subculture or neo-tribe or any of those kinds of things. Not because that stuff's not interesting, it definitely is, but because I would probably be here for a really long time with just lists of academics and sociologists and stuff like that for definitional terms, and that's probably not as interesting as hearing about what people actually have to say about cosplay and their experiences with it. So instead of focusing on that aspect, I wanted to talk a little bit about the community itself and how people feel about it, because as much as the community was definitely a focus of the research when going into it, it was also very much a focus of the research while talking to people. So often when I was talking to people, there was a continual conversation about community, the community itself, people talking about positively about how great the community is, about the community being a place of safety and of support for people, the community as being a place in which like-minded people could really come together and do something really cool. So all of this kind of stuff came up frequently. I think I mentioned in a previous one that there are two interesting things that can happen when you do research. One is that everyone says something the same, and one is when everyone says something different. And when it comes to the community, that was something that was all the same. The importance of the community, the wonderfulness of the community. And that's not to say that there aren't bad things that happen in the community, but the way that they talk about those bad things are often kind of construed as things that are either changing or from the outside coming in rather than the community itself. So what I want to do today is I'm going to kind of break this into three primary sections. The first section, I'm going to talk about some of the positive stories that people have about the cosplay community. In the second one, I'm going to talk about some of the negative stories that people have about the cosplay community. Although whether or not it's about the cosplay community is a little bit more amorphous, but negative experiences about social interaction regarding cosplay. And then the third one will be my kind of quick and dirty analysis. So let's get into some of the good stories, shall we? So talking about the things that everyone had to say that were the same, everybody had a good story about the community. Everybody had a good story about the community. And I would say about 9 times out of 10, when I talked to somebody, one of the questions that I liked to do as summaries near the end was, tell me one of your least favorite things about cosplay and one of your most favorite things about cosplay. And when it came to most favorite, pretty much every single person talked about the community, 9 times out of 10. There were a couple of times where it was something different, but most of the time it was the community. It was how wonderful meeting up with people was. It was about making friends. It was about getting together at a con and meeting new people, but also meeting old friends and that kind of social interaction that you get at those kinds of places. So an example of how this can kind of work is one of the people that I talk to who I've named Stevie. They tend to do group or couple cosplays, so they prefer cosplaying with another individual. So these are friends that either that they had prior to coming to the event. Sometimes it's someone that they found at the time. Sometimes it's someone that they met at a previous event, and that now they are cosplaying together for the first time. But basically, it was always that they enjoyed cosplaying with another person. So this was a really interesting way to talk about the togetherness of the community, is someone like Stevie who actually cosplays in group purposefully. Someone like who I'm calling Grayson always talked about the joy of doing it with friends. So again, cosplaying in a group of people and meeting up with a group of other cosplayers and then going through the con together in your group, that was what the joy was. It wasn't necessarily in the costume itself, but rather, although that is a huge part of it for people like Grayson, but it was also the act of being with other people, the act of doing your fun hobby with other people who enjoy it and see it as a fun hobby. Similarly, Adrian, Arthur, and several other people really focused on the idea of cosplay as a social activity. So they talked about how actually putting together the costume is somewhat of a solo activity, but actually there's a lot of socialization that goes along with it. You learn from each other, how to do your makeup or how to style wigs, or, I'm on a lot of the forums and Facebook groups and Reddit threads and stuff like that. And the number of times people will post up a picture and say, what kind of fabric should I use for this? Or, I'm having trouble with this kind of stitching, or I'm struggling to find a way to do this type of hair or this type of makeup, then people definitely give their support and give their 2 cents and give help and advice. So even though you're kind of alone sewing, it is still in many ways a social activity and something that they do together with the community. For many people, and this is a story that I hear not just in cosplay, but whenever you're talking to people about fan conventions like Comic-Con more generally, is this idea that you can go there alone and then you make friends for life. This was something that was a commonly found for most people there that I talked to. Most people that I talked to discussed going to a con and feeling at first lonely or unsure, or maybe they had a group of friends that kind of ditched them, which was one story that I heard, that they had gone with like 3 friends and one of them had made up the ability to go just so they can meet up with a boyfriend and then ditched their friends for the boyfriend. And then the other person just kind of vanished. And so this person was kind of by themselves all of a sudden when they thought they had come with friends. So when you're in that kind of situation, you start meeting other people that aren't in that original friend group, or maybe you didn't come with an original friend group to begin with. And these are the people that you end up actually staying friends with and getting really close to. So this was something that, again, I've heard before a lot of times with fan conventions more generally. This isn't the first time that I've done research with fan conventions, but it was definitely focused on other cosplayers. And you run up to a cosplayer and go, oh, I love that costume, and how did you do this? And then suddenly you're hanging out all day and swapping Instagram handles, and then you still chat all the time, and you meet up and arrange meetups at other cons and stuff throughout your whole thing, and you make friends for life for a lot of these people. I wanted to end with a really wonderful story that I heard from who I'm calling Sam. Sam has a child who's also into cosplay, and they told me a story about how their child is autistic and so really struggles in school to make friends. And they had a birthday party where they invited all of their friends from school and no one showed up, which is like heartbreaking to hear. You always hate those kinds of stories. So the next year, the kid was really not wanting a birthday. They were really upset about it, obviously reliving that experience. So Sam went and contacted the whole cosplay community, told them the story, and said that the kid wanted to have a My Hero Academia themed birthday. And so every cosplayer showed up wearing a My Hero cosplay. And it was so many people, the whole community from like their huge section of Texas showed up in cosplay to support this child. And I think, that's one of the stories that I think is really wonderful to hear. And I think really sums up the way that people feel about the cosplay community when they're a part of it. It's this place that they can go when they're not feeling fantastic and they know that they're going to have support. It's a safe space for a lot of people, particularly those in the LGBT community, although not always, which we're going to talk about in the next section, but it can be. It can be for a lot of people. And I'll talk about this maybe in a later one, potentially, where a lot of people who have discovered that they were trans through the act of dressing up in cosplay, which I think is also really wonderful and beautiful. So anyway, I thought that was a really nice way of kind of summing up the kind of good aspects of the cosplay community. I probably should have done this in the other order because ending with bad things always really sucks. But I guess I've got my analysis, which is not a bad thing, hopefully. Anyway, we'll get to that. But let's talk about some of the less fun, lovely, heartwarming stories about the cosplay community. And one of them has to do with those stories of trans people that I was just talking about. Adrian, for example, told me a lot about their experiences with transphobia in the cosplay community, but a lot of people voiced the issues of trans women and how much trans women really struggle in the cosplay community because of that transphobia, and obviously trans men also struggle with transphobia. And so, yes, there's a lot of those kinds of issues that are still inherently present, although often it sounded like it was coming more often from people not in cosplay at cons rather than from people in cosplay, but they did still experience it from people in cosplay as well. So it's not something that is exclusively from the outside in. It's definitely, transphobia is still very much present in the cosplay community. Arthur, Adrian, and Blake also talked about issues with pronouns. Now this is something that's really fascinating, and that sounds horrid because these are really bad experiences that people had. It always really struggles for me because I always go, oh, that's really fascinating, but obviously it also really sucks. But what is really interesting, side note to this, is the conversation around the use of pronouns in cosplay and how it differs from other forms of dress play. So, for example, in drag, you would use typically the pronoun of the character when talking about the person who is in drag. So if there is a drag queen walking around, you would use she, her pronouns because that is that drag persona's pronouns. However, with cosplay, you always use the cosplayer's pronouns no matter what character they are dressed as. And so there are people who really struggle with that if you are someone who identifies as male, but you are dressing as a female character. People will use she, her pronouns for you. This can be really troublesome for people who are trans or who are non-binary, who already struggle with the issues of pronouns even outside of cosplay. And then to hear that again when in cosplay can sometimes be really triggering for people. So that was was, again, an issue that people had. And again, this was something that was both inside and outside of the community. This was kind of just an experience of being at cons and in cosplay. But definitely, you know, this is kind of tied to that transphobia and the problems of not quite understanding how the gender dynamic works for this. But yeah, so that was definitely a problem that people experienced and led to a lot of issues for several of them. Similar issues, racism. There's also issues of racism in cosplay, and Emma, who I talked to, who is a person of color, Emma was talking to me about how it actually, in their eyes, is getting a little bit better than it was in previous years, but it still has a long way to go. I'm not Black, so obviously it's less apparent to me when I'm walking around at a con in the way that it would be if I was Black. But I definitely still see problems, and so if I'm seeing problems, then there's definitely more that I'm not seeing. You know what I mean? When I went to one of the cons, I definitely saw someone in blackface. So, you know, that's an issue. Charlie also talked about experiencing and seeing people in blackface at cons. And then there's obviously other issues with Black cosplayers than just people experiencing blackface. A lot of people will tell Black cosplayers that they're not allowed to cosplay characters that aren't also Black or of their same skin tone. Which is a bit silly because there's a lot of skin tones of white, and white people will cosplay anything, so whatever. So you also have people would refer to certain characters or certain cosplayers as, you know, the Black Cinderella or the Black fill in the blank of what they are, as opposed to just calling them, you know, the person who's cosplaying as Cinderella, because they're also just a cosplayer. They also have some struggles with makeup and things like that, because a lot of makeup and cosmetics are geared towards white people. And so, I mean, that's a struggle across the board, even outside of cosplay, but definitely there's a lot of cosmetics in cosplay, and therefore is something that they have to do a lot more work on and towards, and therefore is a bit more money than people who are white have to typically deal with. To continue down the track of phobias and isms, we have ableism. This was something that was brought up a lot to me. I specifically did a call out for disabled cosplayers, and so I was wonderfully inundated in the best way with people who really wanted to talk about their experiences with it. And so I got quite a few people talking to me very honestly about their experiences with ableism in the cosplay community, and particularly at cons. And again, a lot of the experiences was with cons rather than cosplay, but there were a lot of problems with cosplay. So for example, somebody was telling me about how expensive it is to buy a wheelchair. Wheelchairs are expensive, and so a lot of people who genuinely need either walking aids or wheelchairs, they have to buy secondhand because they can't afford them new, because even walking sticks and things like that can be really expensive. And a lot of cosplayers, when they are cosplaying a character who, say, uses a stick or is in a wheelchair, they're not somebody who needs it for themselves, they'll buy secondhand, and so it makes it harder for someone who needs it genuinely to get a hold of those items. So that's a problem that maybe a lot of cosplayers just aren't aware of as being an issue. Similarly, people who kind of pretend to be disabled when they're not, again, because of characterization. But then you get people who think that people who are disabled are just playing that. I don't know why. I don't know why, if the character isn't, why you would assume that the person is just doing it for fun. But there were stories of people asking for someone to, say, remove their walking stick from the photo. And obviously the person was like, well, then I can't, like, stand up. can't like pose or stand or move if I get rid of this, and the person taking the photo not really liking it. People being ostracized from group photos because they were in a wheelchair or had some kind of walking aid. So yeah, there's a lot of ableism in cosplay, and I could probably do like a whole section on just those stories because, oh boy, oh boy, those were some stories. But I don't want to be here for ages. But definitely there's a lot of stories of some really terrible experiences that people have had at cons and from people outside and within the cosplay community in regards to ableism. Then there are issues that aren't as related to social issues like transphobia and ableism and racism and things like that. It's the stressors of social media, and I think this is something that a lot of people can experience in a lot of different avenues of life. But cosplay in particular, I think because there are people who are professional cosplayers who make money being a social media influencer who cosplays, that there's a lot of stress on cosplayers who use social media. And again, the outside forces coming into your social media and kind of trying to tell you what you should or shouldn't be doing can be a lot. In fact, there was somebody that I spoke to, Riley. I spoke to Riley about this. Riley talked about how they actively control their social media to stay at a particular size, which is big enough to get really decent feedback and to have a nice thriving conversation and community and people to rely on, but maintains it to be small so that way they don't get those outside stressors. I had people talking about how stressful it is to stay up on trends on social media when it comes to cosplay, and how often that relies on a lot of money and time sink to stay up on it, and the stress that they feel to kind of keep up on it. So this kind of social media stress of being socially internet relevant, I think can often get to people as well. All right. Analysis time! So, when it comes to the presence of cosplay communities, there are two things to keep in mind. The first of which is going to be focused on those bad things, and the second is the good things, because I had them in the other way around on my notes, but I think it would be good to end on the good things. End on a happy note. But the first thing to keep in mind is that the cosplay community is kind of like a sub-community. You can't really ostracize social context, right? So if I'm here online and I'm presenting this, and I'm very clearly a woman, I'm very clearly speaking English, I am very openly from the UK, or living in the UK, but my voice doesn't sound like I'm from the UK. I immigrated here. There's a lot of social contexts that come with me from my own lived experiences and my own cultural backgrounds, and you people watching it have your own ones that you are bringing into watching this that might impact the way that you perceive me, and mine will impact the way that I perceive what's going on, as well as the way that I perceive myself and the way that I perceive you when you comment or you talk about things. We can try to be as logical and separated from our understandings as humanly possible. You know, as somebody who is very aware of cultural dynamics and the way that societies function and structure themselves, I am very aware of a lot of the social and cultural contexts that I carry with me. However, it's very difficult to fully separate them, so typically what I have to do is just address them and say, look, I know that I come from a society that is inherently racist. I know that I come from a society that is inherently transphobic. I know that I am from a society that is inherently misogynistic, and these carry into the way that I see myself and I see the people around me, and this is something that I can be aware of and that I can try really hard to fight against, but they're still my social contexts, and you can't divorce yourself fully from them. I bring this up because it's important to remember that the cosplay community is a community of people. and they are a community of people from their own social backgrounds, right? It is part of wider society, and you can't separate it fully from wider society because it's embedded within it. It's part of it. It's just there, and there's no getting away from that. And I mention that because, like I said, our society is inherently racist. Our society, at least the UK one, which is where I did a lot of my research, the US one, where I also did research, the US and the UK are inherently racist. They are inherently sexist. They are inherently transphobic. And often outwardly all of these things as well. Not just inherently and quietly, but also often loudly. And so when you go into a sub-community like the cosplay community, you can find a lot of people who are facing similar marginalization, that are facing similar issues from you, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the entire community is devoid of these things. And you can also have someone who is trans and kind of racist. You know what I mean? Like, it's very difficult to strip all of these issues from a community. It's so difficult to do that on a personal level, let alone, a communal level. And so often when you're talking about communities like this, they do carry the burden of the wider society. And unfortunately, our wider societies are bigoted and prejudiced and oppress the marginalized. And so sometimes when you go into sub-communities, those things are there as well. And the cosplay community is not devoid of these things. So, second thing, and I think this is one of the most interesting ones that I really love. So there's this scholar by the name of Benedict Anderson who's done most of his work on issues of nationalism. Say issues, conversations around nationalism and issues of nationalism. And he has this conversation around imagined communities. Now, what he means by imagined communities isn't that the communities aren't real, but rather that there is an imagined understanding that exists between people. So when a British person meets another British person that they've never met, they might assume a lot of similarities in culture and society to them because you both have defined yourselves as British, which obviously, is not always the case. But similarly, you have that with the cosplay community. I've heard a lot of stories about people going to new cons that they've never been to before and not being sure how the community there is, and then realizing that actually we have a lot of these things in common. Same thing with going to different countries. I've heard a lot of UK people going to US and vice versa. And then also people coming from other countries that are not the US or the UK, that come to the UK and again experience cons in a slightly different way, and there's a lot of new things and a different culture aspect, and yet there is a familiarity to cosplay. So when we talk about cosplay as imagined communities, that's kind of what I mean, is that it makes it sound like I think that they've imagined their connections, which is not the case. I think these connections are very real and very actual, and very important to understanding how the cosplay community understands itself and its structure and how it communicates. But that's what I mean, though, is that these things have been constructed by cosplayers over the years and have come to define what it means to be a cosplayer and being a member of the cosplay community, because being a cosplayer is different than being a member of the cosplay community. And that's a really important distinction for a lot of people. And when you go to the cosplay community, this is kind of what they mean. So I like to use Benedict Anderson's idea of the imagined community to kind of understand this relationship that people have with the community in the good sense, in the Sam sense, in the kind of gathering together sense. There's a wonderful interaction that I had before doing this particular research, but it was at a con, where I was kind of starting to feel a little overwhelmed with having to interview so many people, and there's a lot of people at a con, and it can get really overwhelming. And I've since figured out how to cope with that, which can be a different video if you want. But basically, I ended up kind of just chatting with somebody off to the side, being like, here I am here to do this research, but I'm just getting really overwhelmed and I'm really struggling. And they said, oh, well, what's really great about going to cons is you don't have to worry about talking to other people because you know that everyone shares the same values as you. And I think that is, in essence, this idea of the imagined community, right? That you go to a con, you've never met this person before, but you know inherently in your soul, this person has a lot of values in common with me. And so I think that's also kind of really wonderful. And obviously a lot of that goes along with issues that we talked about in the bad section. But hopefully as people are more progressive and welcoming and open in the cosplay community more generally, then that means that they'll be more willing to kind of put the kibosh when they see people being, having different values than them. And because that's what's wonderful about the imagined community, right? Is you can construct what that community means and what it means to be in that community. And so you can define the community as someone who supports trans lives. And so when people are not doing that, you can say, you don't have my same values. You are not a member of this community. So that's kind of a nice side of it as well. So yeah, I think that's it for today. Like I said, I could talk about community for a really long time because there's an aspect of it in every single theme and topic. There's an aspect of it in every single chapter. There's an aspect of it everywhere because it's hard to get away from the social because we are social beings after all. But yeah, I thought it was important to at least talk about some of these issues that people have been facing. And they'll probably come up more as I talk about some of the other things as well, like cons, a lot of ableism at the way that cons are constructed. We can talk a lot about transphobia when it comes to discussions around gender and sexuality in cosplay, a lot of misogyny as well in that conversation as well. So hopefully we'll talk a little bit more about those issues because I don't want to make it sound like I'm not spending the time on them that I am. I just didn't have, I could probably do a whole video like this just to kind of touch on some of these issues. But at the same time, the people who have experienced these issues also talked really glowingly and positively about the cosplay community. So overall, I think the cosplay community has provided a really wonderful resource for a lot of people. Anyway, I've talked for way too long. I will see you next month when I will be doing, I think skill is my next one. If it's not skill, you'll find out next month. In the meantime, check out Incidental Mythology, where I post up blogs on the website as well as on the YouTube channel Incidental Mythology. I have video essays. On this channel, I've been doing vlogs again. I'm working on the book. I'm working on a podcast, new podcast. You can go check out I'm a Fan of That. We've got a trailer out, and at the end of May, there's going to be the first episode. So, well, no, mid-May, 15th of May, there's going to be the first episode. Anyway, that was me plugging a lot at the end. I'm really sorry. But I will see you next time, and hopefully we'll have another little lovely discussion about cosplay. Bye!